Now, I'm joined by an expert panel of speakers this afternoon. I'll allow them to introduce themselves. I'll take it over to you, Graham.
Hi, I'm Graham Fox. I am Head of Technical for the Beazer Group and Refcon.
Hi everybody, my name is Phil Ports. I'm the Head of Marketing and Sales Strategy for Mitsubishi Electric.
Hi everyone, my name's Graham Wright. I'm a Senior Manager for the Environmental Readiness section in Daikin.
Hello, I'm Gary Stanley and I'm the Sales Engineer for TQ Environmental.
Hello, my name's Scott Davies. I'm the Sales Director for JVAC Tools and Advanced Chemicals.
Hello, my name's Mike Charlesworth. I'm the Service Manager from TQ Environmental.
Hi, I'm Steve Gill, Refrigeration Consultant and founder of World Refrigeration Day.
Welcome, gentlemen. I hope you enjoy the following discussion. Okay, so we'll start our conversation today talking about current leak detection practices. Now, we did a little bit of research, just some background, and everyone here has seen the numbers. The good news is there seems to be a lot of compliance in the industry. You know, on the smaller units, typically over 90% have a leak detection check carried out once a year. And on the larger units, nearly 80%. So that's a good start. A bit less consistent is when we look at how quickly people go back to check a system when a leak has been detected, and also some of the recording of some of the leak detection practices that are going on and that kind of thing. So I wanted to open that up to the group just to see what experience you've got out there.
It's really encouraging to see the numbers, obviously, for the smaller units in particular. It looks like people are complying in general. It's important to point out that it is a regulatory requirement that they check the systems. Anything over 5 tonnes CO2 equivalent has to be checked at least annually. What we recommend as Refcom in our guidance is that you do it anyway, even for the smaller systems with less than 5 tonnes, because it's just good practice. You would go and do a service visit on the equipment anyway, so you should do a leak check as part of that service visit. The one about returning after a leak's been repaired is always a contentious issue. The regulation says that after a leak's been repaired, the system must be leak checked again within a month of the repair being done. But it's very vague. It doesn't say if that's a day later, a week later, or 4 weeks later, or indeed a couple of hours later. And practice does seem to suggest that engineers are doing the repair, they're leak checking as they're doing the repair, and then they put the system back into service again, probably while they're packing up their tools, maybe having a cup of coffee, and then they go and do the leak check again. Because the issue that a lot of my members have is who is picking up, who's covering the cost of that return if they're having to go back 3 or 4 weeks later.
Yeah. And I guess, we might return to that a little bit later in terms of responsibility. The question I would have there is, do people's behaviour differ depending on the system that they're commonly working on? So if you're only working in commercial, premises, do you have a different approach to if you're working in hospitality or something like that?
I don't think so. I actually think we work with an industry that's very compliant. And I don't think it matters what kind of system you're working with, whether it be a small split system to a large refrigeration system, or even some big chillers on site. People want to ensure that they're keeping the gas in place, primarily for an environmental reason, but obviously there are other costs, etc. Refrigerant increased in cost sometimes 4 or 5-fold in the space of months. And everyone suddenly went, oh, this is not a commodity anymore, this is actually something, this is a finite resource and I need to protect it. And that made, for me, the whole industry sit up and think about what they were doing, and you see the results there in those numbers.
When you introduce change with F-gas 15 plus years ago and you look at the result it's done, yeah, it's been a slow burn over a long time and a lot of work's been gone into it. But like you say, that's a massive positive for our industry.
I was just going to say the drivers, from my experience of industry, have been safety, obviously risk involved, as you said, about people, and the cost of refrigerant. The regulatory push has been there since F-gas came in, and that has been a slow burn, although it's been required. It's safety and refrigerant costs have been the main drivers.
Mm-hmm. I think it does depend. Looking at the smaller systems, if it's a domestic environment, that's a very different ballgame. Most of the installations that are done commercially or for other businesses, there will normally be business practice in place, but the client is demanding some kind of record being kept anyway. Yeah. So that helps to focus the mind.
I mean, I suppose maybe that is where I was coming from, really, because if it's a householder, they might have a completely different view to if it's a commercial building, to if it's, a risk, fixed leak detection, for example, presumably more high-risk situations where, you can't afford to get it wrong. I mean, what's your experience?
Particularly on things like ammonia, where it's a matter of life and death. It's got to be constantly checked, maintained, serviced, and ensured that it's protecting, one, the people that are working there, but two, also the environment that it could escape into as well. So in that respect, yes, as an industry, I think we've got it spot on, and we do best practice to ensure that well, one, we avoid leaks, but two, if we do have them, it's rectified and dealt with at the earliest opportunity.
I guess all of this leads back to Graham's point earlier on about on that return, because that was the number that actually my eye was drawn to. You spot a leak, you fix it, but then it's a bit questionable whether or not anyone goes back to check it, and there could be quite a long period. And we talked about responsibility for that.
Again, we come across that quite often, where myself and Mike will both do site surveys, and particularly on some of the smaller food manufacturers. So let's say, for instance, somebody who makes sandwiches, and you'll go in to recommend to them what leak detection that they require, and essentially, once we've sized it and priced it, we then pass it on to the contractor who is looking to install it. He then goes down to his customer, and his customer will say, right, let's say, for instance, I've got £10,000 worth of gas, but you want £8,000 to install a leak detection system. I'll take the risk.
But that's what I mean. There's one supermarket chain in particular that started having an all-inclusive contract. It was an all-inclusive package price they paid for the maintenance. All of the refrigerant costs became borne by the contractor. And what that did was it focused the contractor's mind and attention a lot more on making sure the system was leak tight. So there is talk about that kind of contract becoming a bit more common.
I also think there's a bit of a fundamental misunderstanding about who the owner of the equipment is.
Yeah, absolutely.
The owner of the equipment is the person who owns the building. As a maintainer, you're responsible for ensuring that you maintain the equipment within the F-gas regulation, ensuring that the owner of the building is compliant. And I think the misunderstanding is that this second visit that comes along, which is a check visit, it shouldn't be too much of a problem unless they find the leak's returned or another leak. It's just forgotten about because the owner doesn't want to pay for another visit. Quite clearly, the regulation has been written in a certain way to ensure that leaks are stopped as quickly as they possibly can, which is why that methodology was put in place. It could well be that in the future that might get taken away because it's not needed, but at the moment we don't know. And this data very clearly shows that we're not going back for the second visit, primarily because of cost and primarily because the people who own the equipment don't think they own it. They think they've subcontracted that ownership to maintenance companies, where in fact they haven't.
There's also remote monitoring in some of the larger systems, that it's been repaired and the engineer's left. The people monitoring remotely, do we need to go back?
Well, that actually counts under the law about returning to leak check within 1 month. A remote check does count for that.
It does count.
Because the leak check can be an indirect leak check. So you check in operational parameters of a system, which you can do remotely if you have the right software in place. So actually that does help people leave it for a couple of weeks, bed in after the repair, and then check it a couple of weeks later. Because they don't have that return visit cost.
There are manufacturers equipment out there, especially in the DX air conditioning scenario, where you've got systems like VRF that actually have leak detection on board. And that leak detection is not physically checking the leak, but is actually checking the parameters of the system in a certain operational mode. And that is allowed under the F-gas regulation. So that helps, but it doesn't solve the problem, if you understand it. It tells you where you are in terms of your charge in that particular system, but that's not used widely through refrigeration or even some of the less complicated systems.
400 tonnes of refrigerant lost a year in the UK alone. Refrigerant costs money, okay? Who owns that responsibility? We focus a lot on industry and we talk to contractors and we make sure that they're up to speed. But do the customers understand enough? I mean, is there any scope for some kind of communication campaign with customers or something that is more regulatory enforceable to the end user that helps the contractors? Because it does seem to be a problem.
I think an education piece to the particularly some of the larger client base would be really, really useful for the contractors, because I get a lot of members that come to me saying they've identified a leak, the client's refusing to get it repaired, so they don't want to shut the freezer down because they're trying to keep the supermarket open, for example, things like that. And so there's a lot of commercial pressure on the end user in that case, and they're just refusing to allow the equipment to be shut down to be properly repaired. And I get members coming to us for advice saying, where do I stand legally with this? Because I've told them there's a leak and they're not getting it checked. They want me to top it up to keep it going for a couple of weeks.
I think one of the issues is around data and how we record leaks. We need some kind of standard way of recording leaks, and it needs to be stored in a central database. That would then give the owners of the equipment, whoever that might be, a bit of clear responsibility about how they behave and what they need to do. I also think that sometimes money talks, and that's why you get into these situations where someone doesn't want to shut an office down or a production line down and just top things up, which is completely against any of the regulations, but hey, that's life, I suppose, the reality of it.
Data is the key, and the problem is that, Kelly, you mentioned 400 tonnes of refrigerant is lost in the UK every year. That's an estimate. Nobody actually knows how much is lost because that data doesn't exist. There's nowhere that's actually been recording that historically. And we put some software in place we gave to all of our members specifically so that we could actually start collating that data. So I was able earlier this year to give to harvest data for a year's worth of usable data from something like 1,000 contractors. And it's all anonymised, so there's no issues about commerciality or confidentiality or anything like that. And I was able to give DEFRA exact figures for a few refrigerants we just picked out as a sample for them to show what we can do. And it showed the exact amount of refrigerant that's been charged into systems in a year, the exact amount of refrigerant that's been charged as a top-up after a leak repair or after a loss for whatever reason. And so it's only now, and it's only if all the contractors are using a software like that to actually record what they're using that we'll start to gather that real data rather than using estimates.
Well, I think that's the thing, because everything seems to revolve, particularly in the larger clients, the supermarket chains and that it's cost versus profit. If we're losing 400 tonnes of refrigerant every year, then a lot of these chains will be contributing a great deal of that. And if they are made more environmentally responsible towards what they are losing and held accountable for it, then I think, well, I'm not saying it would change overnight, but certainly it's something that would make them sit up more and think about what they are doing and what they need to do.
Yeah, because the numbers, the industry up to the customer, looks like it's doing a good job. But it seems to me that you're kind of 15% or whatever it is you're missing is a hard one to do in our own supply chain because it goes right up to the customer.
And so, like you said, it's how you articulate the story. If you look at the responsibility that Graham talked about, there's two reasons predominantly why we do leak detection. The first is safety. If you've got an ammonia chiller, if you've got an A2L refrigerant in a hotel bedroom or an office, you need to have leak detection. The other is what we're now talking about, is the corporate social responsibility. If these national supermarkets are guided down the route and explained how they are actively contributing to climate change, it's how you articulate that story and show them, the CO2 equivalent of those 400 tons of refrigerant that's been released. That makes a huge difference. But how many of us around this room have actually articulated that to the larger chains that we're talking about? Like you say, we stop at the M&E contractor or the maintenance contractor. It's how much gets through to the actual person with a pound, shilling and pence who says, I've got to close my store for like how many days just to have a regular maintenance check, have leak detection.
There's another slide talking about the engineer's perception of what affects leakage the most. Some of it is on standard of installation and quality of brazing around the joint, how pipes are routed and supported. If you look at the bar chart, there's more people who think that the standard of service and maintenance is a contributing factor. Now, it's back to the point, who's paying for the service and maintenance? Are those service contracts ground the future? If that is to be believed, then that means that it is again the customer. It's the customer appetite to actually pay for this thing to be serviced and maintained.
It doesn't surprise me that statistic that nearly 60% of them are saying the standard of service and maintenance is the biggest cause, because there does tend to be a race to the bottom. So for the service contractor, they're often tendering against a number of different service contractors, and there's always going to be somebody who's going to go in cheaper just because they need the work. And if they're going in cheaper, then they're going to have to cut corners somewhere, and it tends to be you'll get, for example, large VRF systems. You'll get somebody who's pricing that job on the number of indoor units, and they'll do it 20 quid an indoor unit or something. And it's a crazy way to price a job, because you can't possibly do the checks properly.
Talk about the leak detection methodologies. The kind of person that's going in there, is that what's impacting on the methodology, or is it the type of system they're using? So will they have an electronic, a sniffer, or will they have a bubble-up spray or Spectraline kind of product, UV dye? Is that affected by what they're working on, or is it the quality of the contractor?
I think it comes down to the contractor as well, because a couple of the methods you've mentioned there of handheld leak detection and bubble-up spray, and I'm sure you've all seen when people talk, oh, what method do you use? You hear people go, literally fairy liquid. Yeah. And right, so in F-gas regulations, your detector has to detect from 5 grams per year and under. Bubble-up spray is basically a pinpointing product that will not detect, I think it's estimated around 16 grams per year. That's the maximum a spray will leak detect down to. So you've got to find the leak with the leak detector first, but then you can pinpoint it with a spray. However, people will sometimes just go with purely spray and won't own a leak detector. They'll think that's a perfectly good way of leak detection and finding leaks. It isn't. You've got to have both methods, I said, because it comes down to pinpointing or actually finding the leak.
That's a good point. That's a good point, because the bubble method really is only acceptable during the installation when you're doing a pressure leak test, not for an annual leak test under the regulations.
The bubble method, you've got to figure out where the leak is first. So you definitely need a leak detector. I mean, obviously, it depends on the quality of engineer that's looking at it, but they would look at the system and say, okay, this system is underperforming because I think of a lack of refrigerant or for other reasons. And there could be lots of other reasons, by the way, but lack of refrigerant tends to be a deduction of several things that are happening with the system. Then you've got to figure out where that leak is.
Again, it comes down to cost and how much detection you've got. The leak could be over there, your detector's over here, so the amount of gas you're going to lose depends on how much gas detection.
I think that's where you look at what gas you're using and what detector. If you're using a refrigerant that's heavier than air, R410A, R32, this is nothing new, because we all know 6 inches above the skirting board, that's the place, because the refrigerant's heavier than air, that's where it's going to settle. So even a pinhole leak over a few hours will gather in the lowest place on the floor, and you're going to get a high enough concentration to detect that. So that's where choosing your location and the type of detector becomes key.
Does everyone know that? I mean,
Well, I think the way I've always explained it, if a leak detector is available from wherever and it says this leak detector detects everything, that's not a very good leak detector for me, because you could pick up anything. A forklift truck could go past and off your leak detector goes, brilliant, there's a leak there. I think you have to pick the leak detector for the job. As you were saying, hydrocarbons. Yeah. You need a specific leak detector for hydrocarbons, because there could be other units in that area you're working in that have a different refrigerant in it that could be leaking, and it's setting your detector off. And you have one specific for CO2 that only does CO2 and doesn't pick anything else up for the exact same reason. So I think it's very much down to picking the right detector.
Pointing at installation or service is the pipework's already been installed. If there is going to be a risk of a leak, it's actually done. It's normally going to happen either because the pipework's not been put in properly, or it's not supported properly, or something else has happened, like someone hanging something off a bit of pipework that shouldn't be there, shouldn't have been done. Servicing a piece of pipework doesn't really make that much difference to it, other than physically looking at it.
I suppose the only point there is, if you confuse service and maintenance with system inspection, if there was an issue at the point of installation, Well, you're never going to find that out unless you go back and do something, which would probably be a service and maintenance visit, which would involve some level of inspection.
I think there's a differentiation there, and you touched on it before. Is it a service maintenance contract which is done on the number of fan coils, which is cleaning filters 3-4 times a year, or is it a system looking at the system with a qualified engineer who will then be able to pick up a leak, not someone who goes and cleans 50 filters a day, and that's what they're paid to do. You know, they take the check sheet off, they've cleaned the filter, but at no point have they actually looked at how the system's operating. Do they put it in full heat and full cooling, check the head pressure on the compressor, check the evaporating condenser temperatures?
And again,
if you're in a race to the bottom, you're never going to be winning it if you're going to do that level of detailed inspection.
because what we know is happening is with that kind of race to the bottom, then you've got the FM companies who are doing those checks. They're sending out a qualified engineer once a year to do the mandatory F-gas leak check. And the other visits are just, the filter cleans. So they're part-skilled people. So they're not actually technically able to evaluate the operation of the system to tell if there's a leak anyway.
Yeah.
I think something we've noticed as well, I think obviously the industry we look at is the commercial industrial side of HVAC. A lot of the comments you see sometimes come down to automotive HVAC, where you see certain garages openly advertise, we will top up your refrigerant in your air conditioning system, and they sell a can of refrigerant in Halfords. And I think if we have to look at one side, we have to look at both sides. It's got to be industry-wide. It can't just be, oh, well, this sector does that, but that's automotive, so that doesn't really count. We'll just brush that to one side. It's got to be the whole thing, because then you get the engineers on our side saying, well, how come they can get away with it? It's got to be right across the board.
The environment doesn't care where the refrigerant comes from.
No, refrigerant's refrigerant at the end of the day, isn't it? Yeah.
So what we're saying is, we have professional industry, people that are trying to do the right job. There's a bit of a disconnect with what the customer is prepared to pay for, or actually understanding what their own responsibility is and the cost of that. But then we moved into types of leak detection and the fact that not everyone will have everything in the bag. Is that a common problem?
Sometimes that's how, when I was an apprentice, that's how the engineer, he used to do it that way, and that's how I've done it all my life. And I think we've got to get engineers, as I said, the training, who actually goes through specific leak detection training on the products available on the market and how they work and how you detect it, from fixed to handheld to dyes to sealants, and finding the right one for the right purpose. And so I think training is a big part of it, because everyone does F-gas training and they might spend literally 5 minutes in their F-gas training, think they know how to leak detect, or actually as basic as reading the instructions in the leak detecting box, or when your equipment for fixed comes, of what the actual buttons mean, what the different alarms mean, because they do have different purposes.
We work very closely with Grimsby College, and we've supplied them with a leak detection system, R410 and R32, so hotel office application, a sniffer system, and in fact Mike's going next week to install an ammonia system for them as well. And essentially, I mean, it's twofold for us. We want the engineers of the future to be working on our equipment, so when it comes and they're out in the field, I know what TQ do. I've worked on their kit before. I'll get in touch with TQ. But also, we need to educate them at this stage, because this is where they're getting out into the field, and these are the ones that now need the understanding to perhaps sometimes teach the older engineers. I've just come out of college, and this is what we're doing now. This is what's going on, and so the education is continuing throughout the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very much so. I think it's worth doing, because I think that's a great point on actually the younger guys going back to their companies and saying, have you seen these type of products, still using halogen lamps and things like that. I
was just going to say, education and training are not necessarily the same thing, but you're right, we need to educate everybody, because you'll get some of the older, well, I've done the training, but it could be 20 years ago.
We obviously deal with colleges and some of lecturers, we talk to apprentices, we talk to a range of people in the education environment. What we're hearing back is actually, should we have a lot more CPD, kind of continuous professional development? And if you've always been used to the old way, how are we educating people to get up to speed with the new?
I think there's a perception in a lot of industries that CPD is seen as a managerial thing. and I've never been a believer in that. And I know, manufacturers have been doing product training courses that help to upskill and keep engineers up to speed with the changes that are going on. 3 years ago now at Crib, we developed a flammables training course, and that was specifically about giving a CPD type upskilling course. We've had this conversation again at ACRIB Education Committee recently about flammables, and should flammables be an integral part of the F-gas qualification? It absolutely should be. We do it in our own F-gas course. We actually have it embedded in there now. So if you do the basic F-gas course, you're getting that flammables module in there. That should be part of the legislation. So anyone who did a City and Guilds, when I did in 2007, legally, you've never had to do any upskilling in all that time, and it's ridiculous.
That doesn't seem right, does it? I mean, the whole point of CPD is to maintain your professional qualification.
Well, maybe that's a way of looking at it then, because I'm sure we're going to come on to competence, because it's important to note that F-gas qualification is not a competence qualification. It's really just about awareness of the environmental implications of leakage. That's what it's about. It is in no way a competence qualification. One of the big arguments we've had in the industry for years has been that it's kind of dumbed down the industry to some extent, because it doesn't address competence, but it does need to.
But there's work going on in that area.
Yeah.
Very, very much so. But I think there's a bigger picture, actually. And as I say, this continued professional development, so I'm going to use the name for it, is something that I think engineers would really welcome. I don't care what it's called. Yeah, the industry's going to have to change. Every industry's going to have to change with the changes to what is going to be the Building Safety Bill, Building Safety Regulator coming into place. All of this because of Grenfell. And they're going to focus on things like the minimum skills or the technical competencies for people. And I think this is fantastic news for the industry, because what it does, it will list what you need to do, or it needs to have as a qualification, so that you can do your work. And part of that would be leak detection, how to use leak detection equipment, how to make sure everything's done safely. And I'm not saying for 1 minute that the industry's not doing that. It just means that there will be a framework that you'll be recognised to. It will come back down to skill cards. But it's going to be, I don't like using the word revolution, but it's going to be a bit of a change for people to understand how they are going to make sure that their skill card is up to date and is kept up to date. I, for one, do not agree that the City and Guild qualification for F-gas should be a once only. I think it should be once every 5 years as a minimum, because, as you quite rightly pointed out, Graham, refrigerants change every 15 years because we find a better way of doing things. And therefore, those different attributes of that gas need to be taken into consideration, and then everyone made very aware of what's going on. Now, manufacturers have a role to play in it, both Phil and I have been involved with a lot of things to do with R32 in the past, and I'm sure we'll be involved in the future when things change again, because it will happen. But quite clearly, training is really key, and we need to make sure that everyone is up to the same speed.
So let's say there was a gas handling kind of module. Are we all agreed that there would be an appetite for that?
There'll always be contractors complaining that you're forcing them to spend money on something they don't need.
I think we can.
Because the trouble is, you've got thousands, tens of thousands of people who have worked in industry for a long, long time, and they don't feel that they need it.
I think we actually need to deal with refrigerants in the same way we deal with gas safe, for natural gas. It's not because the gases are as flammable or whatever, it's because actually the natural gas we're using is a finite resource which we know about, and the refrigerants that we use, which are the lifeblood of the systems, that are a finite resource. So having some kind of parity with gas safe would make a lot of sense.
I think we can make it easier as well. All training has gone online. You can log on any time, day or night, do the tutorial, and then if it is a hands-on course, if refrigerant safe handling, if it's certainly A2L, then you cut the amount of time you need to be actually in front of somebody down to a couple of hours. There's much more availability of training on the market now, because the pandemic caused everybody to do their training online. And it's a couple of hundred people a week. You've got hundreds a day being trained. So you invest in all your learning platforms. All of a sudden you go, wow, we've got the ability to upskill and train so many more people.
And a day in the classroom is roughly translated to about 3 hours in an online course.
It is, yes.
Yeah. So instead of having to send an engineer away, maybe a couple hundred miles to a training centre and having an overnight stay with the hotels, a whole day off the tools, not earning you money as an employer. Instead of that, they could do it in the office in the morning or in an afternoon, so you can still get half a day productive work out of them, if you like. And that's really, really important for the contractors. And then, like I say, you've only got to go for half a day to some local centre where they can be tested for the actual practical elements of whatever it is that they're doing. So the costs come down to the contractors, and that is really critical.
I think it's another really good example of the way that our industry reacts to a situation it's put in and makes the most of it. You know, we've kind of reinvented training very quickly because we all had to, right? I'm not saying we're clever, we just had to do this because work didn't stop.
Yeah.
You know, it carried on. And I agree, half a day in a classroom is far better than a whole day because the other half of the day they're just bored.
They're bored.
And they're not really listening. And it works with the way that engineers want to work. So, you know, as far as I'm concerned, it's a benefit and it gives us the opportunity. It gives organisations like JVAC the opportunity to create their own training to say, okay, this is how you use your leak detectors.
The contractors that we talk to or that connect to us on social media or whatever, they love little best practice clips. You know, you give them, 20 seconds on Instagram, this is how you do something, it really goes down well. And they talk to each other and help each other out. I just want to put Graham Fox on the spot just for a second and talk about, we've got big changes coming up in 2025 in terms of F-gas regulations, but what do the next 3 or 4 years look like really in terms of compliance and the regulatory environment?
The big changes that are coming are obviously the increasing steps in the